Holy Scripture is the preeminent authority, and any council that contradicts its teaching is not to be followed. John Wycliffe. The first Archbishop of Canterbury was St. Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with his more famous predecessor, St. Augustine of Hippo, who lived more than a century before. Augustine was sent to England by Pope Gregory I in 597, centuries after the Roman hold on England had weakened. He established Canterbury in southeast England as his cathedra or seat. Though there had still been Christians in England after the fall of Rome, Augustine's mission in the late 6th century sought to saturate the region with Christianity. Their efforts bore fruit, and within a century, Christianity was established among the Anglo-Saxons of southern and eastern England. Among them was a monk named Bede, serving in Northumbria in what is today northern England. Bede is most famous for his historical works on the Christian church in England, and as a result, his 8th century history earned him the title, the Father of English History. Christianity and the church remained a constant presence in England during the Danish invasions, and remained at odds with the Norse paganism that the Danes brought with them. However, after the Kingdom of Wessex defeated the Danes in 878, the English won a major religious victory when Guthrum, the Danish king of East Anglia, converted to Christianity, and the Danelaw was established as the boundary of Danish influence in Britain. By the time of the Norman invasion 2 centuries later, the Danes were gone, and England was firmly Roman Catholic. It was thus necessary in 1066 for William of Normandy, the duke who would become a conqueror, to obtain papal blessing before invading another Christian nation. He received it, which allowed him to sail for England without fear of interference from the church. Yet William was soon forced to confront an issue which would plague his successors, be they Norman, Angevin, Plantagenet, Lancastrian, or Yorkist, that of authority over church leaders who were living in England. The Pope had authorized Augustine, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, to begin his mission back in the 6th century. Yet by the 11th century, the English monarchy was strong and sought to centralize power within the country. Bishops would often be appointed directly from the Pope, and this was dangerous to rulers because they couldn't be certain that these new bishops would be loyal to their interests and those of England. The struggle over investiture had begun. This would more or less be resolved by the Concordat of London in 1107, which determined that bishops would be appointed by the church, but that those bishops would have to swear a loyalty oath to the king. While this may have resolved the issues related to the selection of bishops, it didn't solve the problem of their loyalty, as Henry II found out later in the 12th century when he put his chancellor, Thomas Becket, forward to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury. The church agreed to the choice, but things backfired on Henry when Becket decided to place his first loyalty to the church rather than to the king. This would come to a head when Becket refused to ratify the Constitutions of Clarendon, a document that sought to solve another issue in the English church. Fundamentally, the issue was over where priests, monks, and other church leaders would be tried for alleged crimes that they committed in the Kingdom of England. Traditionally, they were tried in special ecclesial courts by their peers, rather than in the royal courts whose authority derived from the king. Henry thought this unfair, and that priests would escape punishment for crimes they committed. The Constitutions of Clarendon agreeably divided this authority, but Becket refused to sign it, a bold denial by the most powerful churchman in England. Among the responsibilities held by the most powerful religious figure in the English church was the crowning of monarchs. William the Conqueror was a notable exception to this because the archbishop at the time of his coronation was not recognized by the Pope. Otherwise, it was tradition that the Archbishop of Canterbury would crown the king. which is why Becket was snubbed when Henry II had his son and heir, Henry the Young King, crowned without Becket's participation. The conflict between Becket and Henry would end, as we've already discussed, with Becket's death and Henry's forced penance and submission to the church. In the tug of war between church and state in medieval England, the church gained a major upper hand during the reign of King John. The issue began when King John refused to accept the official appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1207. John exiled the archbishop, and in turn, Pope Innocent III placed England under an interdict, meaning that church doors were more or less closed and priests were unable to perform their sacraments, with limited exceptions. The religious life of England effectively ground to a halt for 6 years before John yielded and submitted to the Pope as his feudal lord. In word, if not so much in practice, all of England belonged to the church, though this was not enforced long term. Issues continued between the church and state over the nature of land belonging to the church and donations to the church as a form of tax evasion. Yet the greatest shift in the English church prior to the Reformation was brought about not by a king, but by a university professor and priest named John Wycliffe. Teaching at Oxford in the 14th century, Wycliffe became convinced that the Bible, rather than church leadership, was the supreme source of authority for the Christian faith. He realized, as a result, that there was a need for a Bible translated into English and therefore accessible to more than just those who knew Latin. Though he was condemned during his lifetime and his teachings were considered heretical, Wycliffe died a natural death in 1384, and his followers, known as the Lollards, continued to spread his teachings. More than a century later, Martin Luther would identify the same issues plaguing the Catholic Church and would launch a far more successful Reformation, which we know today. However, the early work and influence of John Wycliffe would prepare the ground of England for a turbulent Reformation to come.